Let's frame it out first with what I wanted to share. This is a week in which I've been thinking a lot about endings. Certainly because Yom Kippur feels like the end of a really big chapter of the Jewish calendar, even though Sukkot is fast approaching and we shouldn't forget it. And this morning's Parsha, Ha'azinu, is also a really important ending. It's the last portion of the Torah cycle that we read on Shabbat morning. And that often gets a little bit lost in the shuffle, coming right after Yom Kippur, coming right before Simchas Torah. We find ourselves in a situation this morning where maybe kind of this Shabbat morning got a little bit overlooked. But more than thinking about specific endings, I've been thinking about endings in general, and how they're really difficult to pull off. Ne'ilah always feels that way, and this is something Alex and I have discussed, and therefore we kind of poured over the planning for the final hour of that day, making sure we would get it just right and not run over time, or try as hard as we could to get it just right while not running over time. I promise that we tried. For me, when I write, when I'm trying to prepare the words that I want to share with all of you and get them down on the screen, starting the process is generally pretty doable. That comes reasonably easily to me. It's the last paragraph that keeps me pacing around the room, that leaves me staring at the blinking cursor as I try to determine how best to put an end cap on my own message and feel like I can walk away. Moses, or the editors of Deuteronomy, however you choose to view it, I'm just going to speak through the lens of Moses, takes a novel approach to this impending ending. He resorts to poetry, or song, and in this context of ancient Israelite literature, poetry and song are one and the same. Thematically, in this poem, there isn't much here that hasn't been said before, or has not been included elsewhere in Deuteronomy. But the form gives it a whole new level of resonance, a different approach to make sure it sticks with the people for generations. And to be clear, this song is not written for the Israelites whom we imagine standing there listening to it. The first generation would be just fine. But the forces that Moses invokes as his witnesses in the first two lines, and I'm on page 1185 if you want to look along for yourself, Ha'azinu hashamayim va'adabera va'tishma ha'aretz imrei fi. Ya'arof kamatar lichi tizal katal imrati kasirim ale deshe v'charfivim ale esev. Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter. May my discourse come down as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like showers on young growth, like droplets on the grass. Heaven and earth, life-giving rain and dew, these are the foundations of human existence that will serve as witness for this message for all generations. In fact, the rabbis of the Talmud wrote of the text of this parsha, how great is this song? It encompasses the present, it reflects on the past, it speaks of the future, and it contains both this world and the world to come. Carl Sandburg, the Pulitzer Prize-winning 19th century poet, recognizes that this expansive poet power is always present in poetry, writing, similarly to the rabbis, I think, that poetry is the journal of the sea animal living on land, wanting to fly in the air. The God language used in Ha'azinu reflects the all-encompassing and timeless nature of the poem. God is described as a warrior, an eagle, a father and a mother, a provider, a judge, and healer, and most of all, a rock. God is rock, Tzur in Hebrew, is novel to this poem, and at least in the Torah text. While it will become more widely used in later biblical writings, using this term rock or tzur is another clear reference to objects that transcend time, that will carry the words of this song through the generations. Timelessness is clearly what God and Moshe had in mind. At both the beginning and the end of the poem, Moshe reminds the people how important these particular words are. In the closing lines of last week's Parsha, in the introduction to the song, God tells Moses to write down this poem and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, and it will never be lost from the mouth of their offspring. And at the end of his recitation, Moshe again reminds the people, take to heart all the words with which I have warned you this day. Enjoin them upon your children, that they may observe faithfully all the terms of this teaching. The text is deliberately vague about whether it has just Parshat Ha'azinu in mind or the entire Torah. But the context, that these verses bookend this poem, is hard to ignore. In fact, there is evidence that this section of the Torah did hold elevated significance. Jeffrey Teague emphasizes that despite the command to write it down, this poem was created for oral recitation. The parallel structures and the vocabulary choices, especially Hebrew words with common roots that are used throughout, although lost on most of us who are not biblical Hebrew scholars, would have presumably left an impression on ancient listeners. Combine that with the frequency of direct addresses to the people, talking to you, the listener, and surely the words of this poem would be resonating in your head long after the recitation ended. Teague also points out that the recitation was a regular feature of the temple service. This parsha was read on a 6-week cycle during the weekly Shabbat Musaf offerings. This sounds like a precursor to our own Torah service, focused on just one portion, which, if you do the math, would be read a total of about 9 times a year. Teague also cites a Sephardic custom of reading this song or poem in place of the Song of the Sea, Az Yashir, during morning services on Tisha B'Av. The endless cycle of recitation of this poem in temple times brings to my mind a famous teaching from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. And again, those of you who have come to adult ed, I expect you'll be familiar with this one. Ben Bagbag taught, turn it over and again turn it over, for all is therein, and look into it and become gray and old therein, and do not move away from it, for you have no better portion than it. This challenge from Rabbi Bagbag is what makes this poem such an effective end cap to the Torah. With the poem's heavy use of metaphor for us to unpack and explore, we need to revisit it and study it in order to achieve understanding. And it may not always be easy or satisfying, but hopefully, with each turning, we uncover something new. Sharon and I have spent these weeks of the holidays rolling the Torah back and forth, trying to find the right place, making sure that you wouldn't have to wait for us to do it in real time while services were going on. And as we roll, we tend to pause along the way, making sure we don't zip by the place that we're looking for, but also when we see a familiar passage, or to look upon a scribal oddity is not quite the right word, but if you're passing through the 10 Commandments, one of these poems, some of the letters that are written extra large, you kind of can't help but stop and point out, hey, I know what that is. I recognize that. With these words of Ha'azinu, which contain many familiar passages and a distinct scribal form, I'm reminded that Moses solved the problem of how to write a good ending. Send everyone right back to page 1 to turn it over and turn it over again.